All right. Hello and welcome. I am trying to get something going with my I'm using my phone and a lavalier microphone to see if I can actually make videos in my office, which would make for a slightly more interesting background, I think. But anyway, we're going to go through the first half of Chapter 3 of America's Great Depression today. Again, we're dealing with some very dense material, so I'm trying to keep it relatively bite-sized for people. I'm covering about half of the chapter, 13 of 25 pages, something like that. And so, let's get right into it. The title of Chapter 3 is Some Alternative Explanations of Depression, a Critique. Basically, Rothbard's main point here is that some economists say, sure, ABCT, Austrian Business Cycle Theory, does explain some cycles, but there are also cycles that it doesn't explain, and maybe some other theories can explain those other cycles. Now, Rothbard says that this is kind of erroneous, and the problem is that government action can always precipitate a crisis. And here, you may remember that in the first episode of this, where I was covering the first half of Chapter 1, that Rothbard was talking about cycles, and I was saying, well, what about, catastrophes? Well, here, Rothbard does make the change in definition, or defines the term in such a way that it helps deal with that objection that I had earlier on. And he basically says that things where there's a proximate cause, an obvious, this is a thing that happened that caused, the economy to be all messed up, he calls those crises and not cycles. They're not the same as boom and bust cycles because they have that proximate cause. And the issue with boom and bust cycles is that they seem to kind of come out of nowhere. Nobody can really predict them. And once you get close enough to them to predict them, there's not really any way to seemingly to prevent them at that point. So, in this chapter, Rothbard's going to cover a couple of different causes, or a couple of different possible other causes of cyclical booms and busts, and kind of give his critique of all of them. Now, we're going to cover three sections today. We're going to cover the general overproduction section, the underconsumption section, and then the acceleration principle section. Now, the interesting thing is that the acceleration principle section is actually really just an extension of the underconsumption section. Apparently, underconsumption is got a lot of really nuanced, what would you call them? Like nuanced variations that all need to be debunked. And so Rothbard's going to go through them. But he does start out with the general overproduction theory, and he describes it as this. Basically, some people say, hey, the crisis of a boom-bust cycle is marked by a lot of unsold goods, by a lot of unused capacity in the economy. And so what's actually the problem is that there's been a general overproduction of goods in the economy, and people can't buy all these goods that have been created. And the problem with this, as Rothbard states, is that there's really no such thing as general overproduction. General overproduction is really just the economy getting better at serving people's needs. Because if it's a true general overproduction, then everyone is making more, and so they can sell what they're making more of to make what they need to buy the stuff that other stuff that there is more of. Even in deflation, money could be used to buy up overpriced or overproduced goods if they existed as such, right? But what actually often happens is that businessmen will try to hold up prices and refuse to sell, but that's not actually a part of the bust per se. It's really what it is it's businessmen, quote-unquote, investing in inventory, kind of against their will, not against their will, but grudgingly investing in inventory. And that's not really going to cause a general depression. Selling prices, what happens in a depression is that selling prices have fallen below the cost of production for a variety of goods. And the purpose of entrepreneurs is to figure these costs out and figure out, whether a thing should be produced based on whether or not it's going to be profitable. Well, in the case of a boom-bust cycle, as Rothbard is describing, entrepreneurs happen to bid costs higher than selling prices. The reasons for this are because of the artificial and incorrect signals being sent by credit expansion. Basically, there can be overproduction of specific goods, but that would have to be accompanied by underproduction of others. General overproduction is not really a thing that would cause a depression. So, Rothbard only really spends about a page on this, but what I will say is that if you want to know more about it, he does have a footnote number 2, on page 56, where he says, see the book Banking and the Business Cycle, which is written by C.A. Phillips, T.F. McManus, and R.W. Nelson, and he specifically marks out pages 59 through 64. If I can find a copy of that book, I will put a link in the description. So the next theory is the basic underconsumption theory that Rothbard wants to kind of take apart a little bit here. And the idea behind this theory is that there's either too much investment or too much income is being provided to the upper income groups. The consumer demand is insufficient to buy what has been produced. I can't read my own writing. I screwed up a U. How do you screw up a U? Anyway, so here's the thing. Consumption levels have a minimum. You can't stop consuming entirely. You have to consume enough to keep yourself alive. And if consumption falls for an extended period, the people are buying less and buying less and buying less and buying less. First off, there has to be a termination for that. But assuming that they're not at subsistence. But if that happens over a period of time, then prices should be able to adjust. And he includes, I think, both goods prices and wages in that statement. The fact is that it's the entrepreneur's duty to predict consumer demand and make up the appropriate preparations for it, right? And there's not really, and this underconsumption method doesn't really make any explanation for this cluster of errors that happens. Entrepreneurs are going to make mistakes, but they aren't usually going to all make the same mistakes the same kind of mistakes at the same time. And that is what's going on in a boom-bust cycle. The point that Rothbard kind of underlines is that the machine of productivity expands because people want to consume more. And therefore, production can't really outrun consumer demand in general. If production outruns consumer demand in general, that's just society becoming richer. It has to either be in individual little places where there's ups and little places where there's downs. It can't be general, because general increase of production is just a growing economy. It doesn't have any reason why that would cause a depression. There's a caveat here, because there's also the possibility that there could be an alleged shift of relative income, I'm quoting, to profits and to the higher income brackets during a boom. Since the rich presumably consume less than the poor, the mass does not then have enough purchasing power to buy back the expanded product. There's a lot of problems with this. For instance, marginally, on the margins, the rich might not consume less than the poor, because they might see it as a windfall. We've had this argument already in an earlier chapter. If you give a rich person an extra $50,000, they might actually just consume it all because they're like, well, what the heck, this isn't part of my plans, I may as well do something with it. And of course, there are some rich who are, laborers, and there are some laborers who are poor. It's not really the right. There was an earlier part where he says this is a really bad way. This is a really not bad. It's bad, but it's also a really inaccurate way to manipulate the economy. And so it's not necessarily a shift. And also during the boom, you don't necessarily see a shift of incomes from the poor to the rich during the boom. The rich and entrepreneurs all consume just like the poor do, and savings are, roughly speaking, the demand for the producer's goods. These are necessary to sustain the production, the structure of production, the long-term, factories, etc. In order to sustain a higher standard of living, you must permanently lengthen and add to the structure of production. And gross inventory doesn't show up in GDP. Actually, I'm gonna read this real quick because this is worth going over carefully. Okay, here we go. Quote, savings, which go into investment, are therefore just as necessary to sustain the structure of production as consumption. Here we tend to be misled because national income accounting deals solely in net terms. Even gross national product is not really gross by any means. Only gross durable investment is included, while gross inventory purchases are excluded. It is not true, as the underconsumptionists tend to assume, that capital is invested and then pours forth onto the market in the form of production, its work over and done. On the contrary, to sustain a higher standard of living, the production structure and capital structure must be permanently lengthened. Now, the point here, the little point here that I want to kind of underline is that he's noting that GNP, gross national product, can be deceptive because it can miss out on things that must happen for the economy to grow. So it's worth noting that these are things to pay attention to. Yeah. If you want the economy to grow, you need to increase savings so that there can be more investment, so that there can be more capital structure, so that the standard of living can be increased. Savings, in this sense, are not ever wasted from expanding the economy, or at least trying to. So another misconception, I made a mess. Oh well. So another misconception is that expanding production can depress the economy because prices will fall. Well, the fact is that units costs can fall if there's like a general increase in production, but profitability is not injured by this because prices and wages should all fall as productivity goes up. The wages will fall less than consumers' goods. Now, what governments often do is they say, well, we're going to inflate the money supply. We're going to print money to temper this natural price deflation because that way people can just kind of keep getting paid the same thing, and we don't have to adjust anymore. But what this does is it initiates this boom-bust cycle. If underconsumption theory was valid, consumers' goods industries would depress more. They would have surpluses. But this is not what we see when there's actually a depression. So, therefore, according to Rothbard, the underconsumption theory is incorrect. Now we move on to the acceleration principle, which is a little difficult to get through, so I may end up doing some figures here. But the point is, or the point of the acceleration principle is that it's an attempt by underconsumptionists to explain the fluctuation in demand or prices in producers' goods, and it fails for a variety of reasons, which we're going to go over here. So, just to outline what the theory is. If consumer demand changes, what this does is it creates a leverage effect on demand for producers' goods. And the more long-term those producers' goods are, the more the leverage effect is. At least this is what they claim. There's an example about a firm buying machines, which I think we're going to go over verbatim just to avoid having any mistakes or confusion. Okay, here we go. Assume, for example, that a firm is producing 100 units of a good per year and that 10 machines of a certain type are needed in its production. 10 units of good produced per year per each machine. Then, suppose further that the average life of the machine is 10 years. Then, in equilibrium, the firm buys one new machine each year to replace the one worn out. Now suppose that there is a 20% increase in consumer demand for the firm's product. That is, the demand for goods goes from 100 to 120. Consumers now wish to purchase 120 units. If we assume a fixed ratio of capital output, it is now necessary for the firm to have 12 machines. It therefore buys 2 machines next year, purchasing a total of 3 machines instead of the 1 that it would need for simple replacement. Thus, a 20% increase in consumer demand creates a 200% increase in demand for the machine. Hence, say the accelerationists, a general increase in consumer demand in the economy will cause a greatly magnified increase in the demand for capital goods. A demand intensified in proportion to durability. Skipping a little bit, suppose that consumer demand remains at 120 units in the succeeding year. What happens now to the firm's demand for machines? There is no longer any need for firms to purchase any new machines beyond those necessary for replacement. Only 1 machine is still needed for replacement this year. Therefore, the firm's total demand for machines will revert from 3 the previous year to 1 this year. Thus, an unchanged consumer demand will generate a 200% decline in the demand for capital goods. Extending the principle again to the economy as a whole, a simple increase in consumer demand has generated far more intense fluctuations in the demand for fixed capital. Now, this sounds reasonable at the outset, but Rothbard notes that this is a bunch of fallacies all put together. So, number 1, we've got the obvious pattern of 1 replacement per year assumes that 1 new machine has been added in each of the 10 previous years or in some decade before, which makes the dubious assumption that there's been this rapid expansion over the last decade or so. This isn't really an equilibrium situation. And it's also really not reasonable to explain it as a boom and depression as only occurring after a decade of previous expansion, right? This 200% increase in demand for machines followed by the 200% decrease, they're calling it a boom and a depression, but this isn't really what that would be, because there's been a bunch of expansion before that for the last decade or so. It's possible, for instance, that the firm bought all of its 10 machines at once, right? An entrepreneur could have a set of funds and decide to get into a certain industry producing a certain thing. He could decide to buy X of these machines at the same time and just run through them until he needs to replace X of them 10 years later. If that happened, I'm quoting again, then replacement demand by the firm would occur only once every decade. At first, this seems only to strengthen the acceleration principle. After all, the replacement denominator is now that much less, and the intensified demand so much greater. But it is only strengthened on the surface, for everyone knows that in real life, in the normal course of affairs, the economy in general does not experience zero demand for capital, punctuated by bursts every 10 years of investment. That just doesn't happen. Now, the thing is that this is a much more intense variation from what the accelerationists say happen when consumer demand increases. And if the economy can take care of this, 10% burst or factor of 10 burst, factor of 10 drop, factor of 10 burst, factor of 10 drop every 10 years, then it can take care of this little 200% thing too, if it happens to exist. But the best part is that even that's not true, because Rothbard notes that there's a fallacy discovered by W.H. Hutt in his article called Coordination and the Price System, which is unpublished but supposedly available from Fee. I'll see if I can find a link to that for you guys. But the point that Hutt makes is that it makes no sense to arbitrarily choose 1 year as the time period that we're looking over these things. In fact, it would make as much sense to choose 1 year as it would make to choose 1 week. And from the 1 week perspective, it makes absolutely no sense. And so what he says is that what you should look at is really the lifetime of the machine. And if you do that, then it's clear that actually there's no... What happens if you look over the lifetime of the machine is that the demand for machines from this organization, from this corporation, goes from 10 to 12, which is exactly the 20% increase that consumer demand observed. And so we can see that because entrepreneurs understand that the machine has a finite life, that they can plan for this, and that the increases in consumer and producer good demands increase precisely in proportion over the valid, reasonable timescale. And so, yeah, I mean that breaks it down basically entirely. It's all the fallacy of like choosing your start point and choosing your end point arbitrarily to give yourself the result that you want, basically. It's also worth noting that the acceleration principle assumes no substitution. It assumes more or less intensive working of different factors, and it assumes that capital is finally divisible. But there's one more fatal flaw, is that there's no mention of a price system in this system, in this theory, or entrepreneurship. It is true that a change in consumer demands will change prices. And what the accelerationists have done is they've come up with something that's hopelessly mechanistic. Basically, what would happen is that the prices for goods would increase if demand increased. That would increase the profits that an individual machine is worth. Entrepreneurs would see this happening. They would see these hiccups in demand as obvious from the production of machines, and they would act appropriately, and they would buy the extra machines when they had the money from their newfound profits to afford them. It would happen gradually across the whole economy. We can go back to the 7-year locust example, right? The idea would be that, there's going to be a boom in the locust killing industry every 7 years, because every 7 years there's a locust swarm. Well, entrepreneurs know that this cycle is coming, and what they're supposed to do, what they're good at, is they're good at figuring out when to invest in what to have what they need at the right time so that they can, kill the locusts, or at least prevent the damage from the locusts. And, it's totally wrong to just jump from this single firm having this issue to the whole economy. What would actually happen is that there's a bunch of different firms that all have these machines, and, they'd have different time frames that they would choose to buy or expand their number of machines, and it would smooth out in the economy, basically, because there wouldn't be any reason for that to be correlated. And the other point that Rothbard makes, here we go, is that this is really a concentration system. It's not generally economic, and therefore it's not valid. How did the 20% increase in consumption of the firm's product come about? Generally, a 20% increase in consumption in one field must signify a 20% reduction of consumption somewhere else. In that case, of course, the leap from the individual to the aggregate is peculiarly wrong, since there is then no overall boom in consumption or investment. If the 20% increase is to obtain over the whole economy, how is that increase to be financed? We cannot simply postulate an increase in consumption. The important question is, how can it be financed? What general changes are needed elsewhere to permit such an increase? These are the questions that accelerationists never face because their system is completely mechanistic. And so, basically, the acceleration principle neglects the economic problem completely and disastrously. Of course, that doesn't prevent people from pretending that this makes a lot of sense, even though it doesn't. So, that kind of covers most of the important points in the first half of Chapter 3. Next time we'll be covering a couple more theories. The dearth of investment opportunities theory, Schumpeter's business cycle theory, qualitative credit doctrines theory, and finally, the over-optimism and over-pessimism theories. So, I'll work on that, and go check out Rothbard's America's Great Depression. We will cover more of this soon. Still very dense, but this is the last hardcore theory chapter, so we're going to be going into actually some history stuff soon, the week after next, I guess, if I can get things produced. And, see you next week. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. We'll be covering more Great Depression as soon as I can get those notes done and, read over the thing and figure it out. And, well, we'll see if the audio is any good on this one. Anyway, see ya!